Is weird, odd, strange, or just plain bizarre is really your cup of tea? Then, the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast will give you that fix. Can't believe it? Well, listen for yourself as we deliver the strangest news you definitely won't find on CNN or Fox. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Weird News Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Contagious Caleb. Today I'm going to try something new. I'm not going to edit this video at all, and we'll see how that turns out. We're going to start today's episode with what I would consider my weirdest stories of the week, including a New Zealand man who gets paid $10,000 a year to be the city's official wizard. In the second segment, we'll get to my innovative stories, in which a company discovered how to use beer as a green energy source. Now, I've always had a controversial opinion on green energy. We'll get to that. But my Midwestern bumpkin theory is that green energy is usually not green nor energy. So, we'll get to that and all its brilliant controversy. And then in the third section, we are going to do an atrocity theme, so all of the stories will be based on atrocities, including a man who escaped from prison and was caught nearly 50 years later. This comes from my home state, Colorado. And then in the fourth and final segment, we will be going over my top 10 wizards. These are historical wizards who are thought to have been impactful throughout history. So if all goes well, we will make it to that. For now, my most weirdest stories, starting off with the aforementioned New Zealand man who gets paid $10,000 a year to be the city's official wizard. This all began in a small town called Christchurch in New Zealand, which actually boasts that it's not out of the ordinary for a wizard to be hired on the spot. In fact, the city itself has an official wizard who was born in the United Kingdom. His name is Ian Brackenbury, and he began his wizardry services in the 1970s. In order to prove how serious he was, the man had himself a New Zealand driver's license made, which was actually issued in his wizard name. Now, before we go any further, it should be noted that I've never read or watched anything regarding Harry Potter, so keep that in mind if I sound rather arrogant as this story goes on. Anyway, the man has become known as somewhat of a tourist destination for the city. He tends to reside in the paved square on Christchurch's cathedral, on which he pontificates his life theories. Of course, he always wears his wizard robes in order to promote himself. And during the long day, you will find himself boasting that he has earned 4 out of 5 stars on TripAdvisor. Since 1998, he has been paid $16,000, in New Zealand dollars, of course, annually by the Christchurch City Council for, quote, wizardry. The man at 87 years old finds himself spending less time in the public eye, reallocating that time in order to find a successor. He often boasts that he has several men lined up who are more powerful than him himself, including 39-year-old Ari Freeman, who fronts a psychedelic funk band. This story brings me a lot of hope, because finally it has been revealed that there is a tremendous parallel between wizards and United Kingdom psychedelic funk bands. It's just so bizarre. Honestly, both of those seem equally outlandish. However, I must say I can actually say I see more merit within the $16,000 being sent to the wizard by the Christchurch City Council, by the taxpayers, than I will ever see from a psychedelic funk band from the United Kingdom. I'm not a big fan of taxes, but I think I would be happy if I could say that my taxes were going to support wizardry. Now, it's probably assumed that this wizard doesn't have as much fame as he's giving credit in this story. However, it is said that while he was being interviewed at an inner-city cafe, several middle-aged cyclists called out to him, "No casting spells, fella." And the wizard replied, "Can't promise anything." So he's at least locally famous, and the people are apparently proud of how their tax dollars are being spent on wizardry. Screw healthcare. Every American has the right to the services of a wizard, in my opinion. One of my more controversial views, perhaps. Now, it should be noted that this wizard actually has an abundant set of qualifications. His resume ranges from being a Royal Air Force officer in Canada all the way to being an English literature teacher at a university. So he's perhaps overqualified to be a wizard. But it's said that he gave all of that up when he moved to Australia, and his wife convinced him to spend his life playing a wizard. Once in Australia, he started a revolution called the, quote, Fun Revolution. I should have included that last time in my top 10 revolutions, but oh well, missed opportunities always coagulate themselves around me, so I will move on as is tradition. The wizard dedicated his life to love, logic, and levity, and eventually turned his university into a, quote, theater of the absurd. He then lost his university job. Surprisingly enough, universities do not thrive on the absurd. However, after being fired, he convinced the university to make him their official wizard. I like how he just comes up with that title, asks his university for a job under that title, assuming that it's a normal university job. I mean, I went to a film school. They didn't have any wizards there. And this man who became a wizard, he knows this fair and well. He said, quote, "I've invented a wizard out of nowhere. There were no wizards when I arrived in the world, except in books." So look, people, I don't mean to get political, but when I say it's important to vote, it's important to vote. You don't want to be spending $16,000 a year of taxpayer dollars on wizards in universities. Some of us would already contend that teachers in universities should be considered wizards as they have no basis in reality. Anyways, that's just my ridiculous cynicism shining through. I hope you guys don't take me seriously. That would be a serious misstep on your part. Anyways, it is said that this wizard has stated that his role is to be a provocateur. So perhaps he's succeeding. He certainly provocated me. He claims that he is, quote, someone who brings a sense of fun to the world, but also criticizes the system. A showman who doesn't mind making a fool of himself. Well, god dang, it sounds like I should be a wizard then. He goes on to say, every day the world gets more serious. So fun is the most powerful thing in the world right now. And I actually wholeheartedly agree with that. That's why I'm glad I get to do the weird news rather than the real news. Real news is something you go to get angry at. Weird news is something you go to laugh at. But of course, the world is not all faith, trust, and pixie dust. This man has many criticizers, not excluding myself, one of which said, quote, academics don't like silly, fun things. I think that's the wrong approach if you want to get rid of a wizard at a school, is to say that people don't like fun things. I don't know who came up with that slogan, but it's not a great one. Hi, I'm Jeff, and if you vote for me, I will make sure there are no fun things. Now, unfortunately, this story takes a dark, dark turn, as when the man became a wizard, he said that he lost all his friends and even his wife. He claims that her throwing him out of the house actually turned into a annual ritual in which he invites his friends to come over. He says, quote, "To me it was fun, but to her she's still furious." So for any of you trying to hold together a marriage, wizardry is not the right path to take in such a scenario. So what motivated the wizard to stay as an employee of Christ Church? He said, quote, "It was a beautiful place far from the rest of the world, and it was likely to become a hub of economic development." Whenever I watch those old movies on Merlin the Wizard, I'd always remember him talking about economic development. Perhaps the foremost goal of any wizard out there should be economic development. Anyway, upon his first week of employment, he apparently dressed as John the Baptist, and he went out into the cathedral square and praised the British Empire and criticized what he called, quote, "anti-male sexism." I'm glad us males have wizards on our side. In World War III, when it's men against women, at least we'll have wizards. You know, that's something to help battle emotional strength and stability. We'll need it. Anyway, the man was eventually criticized for his position on sexism, and in order to prevent his own firing, he eventually started speaking exclusively in French, claiming that, quote, "silly games with the council have forced me to wear a gas mask and speak in French, hoping to evade their rules." So all he has to do is speak in a language that nobody understands, and he will not be fired. He will continually be paid $16,000 of taxpayer money. He went on to say, quote, "I've been the most popular man in Christchurch since I've been in office, and the most hated man by the bureaucrats." That's beautiful. He's fighting the power, fighting the establishment. Finally, a true man of the people. In 1982, the New Zealand Art Gallery Directors Association said that he was, quote, "a living work of art," as well as a, quote, "artistic's corporeal substance." That doesn't make much sense. I guess it's the physical embodiment of an artist. But that doesn't mean his merit is completely confabulated. He was eventually invited to a rain dance in the local agricultural fair, and only after a few hours after he began beating his drum, quote, "the wizard adjourned to the refreshment tent to watch the downpour and partake of the free whiskies that were trussed into the hands by the visible shaken farmers." So apparently he began this rain dance, and it began to rain. Isn't that incredible? I've never heard of it raining before in Europe, in the United Kingdom. This man truly is a wizard, as he says he is. When asked about the fact that taxpayer dollars were being spent on his hiring, the wizard said, quote, "No doubt there will be implications in the area of spells, blessing, curses, and other supernatural matters that are beyond the competence of prime ministers." And that's where he ends his statement. I know it only sounds like half of a statement, but that's where he decides to end it. I suppose what he's saying is that prime ministers are great and all, but they can't cast spells, they cannot incur blessings on the people, and they can't incur curses on those who deserve it most. Not to mention that supernatural matters will have to be left to those not in a federal position to dictate among the people. Perhaps his purpose as a wizard is being well utilized, and the $10,000 worth of New Zealand dollars is being well spent on his services. I, for one, disagree, but that's only because I'm a greedy Scrooge. Alright, that's it for this segment. I believe I went a bit long on that story. I'll try to cut it up for you guys in the edit. But next story we're going to get to is going to be our Florida story of the week, in which a small plane makes an emergency landing on a Florida highway. We will also continue with my most outrageous stories of the week, including a Trolls doll who has a push button in her private parts that makes her exclusively groan. So we'll get to that after the break. Stay tuned.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast, where we will be going over the weird news of the week for the full hour. We just talked about a man being hired as a wizard. Later on, we'll get to my top 10 wizards throughout all of history. But for now, it's time to go into our most absurd of the weird news, including a female doll who has a button that makes her groan, located right in her private parts. I will note right away, to avoid any and all offensiveness, that the doll has been pulled from stores. This was due to a barrage of complaints from parents petitioning that the voice promoted a sexual and erotic response when its genitals were pressed. Now, the controversy begins as this is one of the more innocent-looking dolls on the market. It's simply one of the Trolls World Tour dolls. The doll's name is Poppy. And apparently on the doll, there are two sensors that kids can press in order to make sounds. One of them is on the doll's stomach, and this is the primary one, the one that parents are allowed to try out before purchase of the doll. And it has very innocent phrases such as, quote, "How about a hug?" The problem arises in this story as the second sensor is located under Poppy's skirt and between her legs. When pressed, it activates the doll to gasp and make other sounds, including wee and ooh. Of course, due to the problematic placing of the second button, the doll has been recalled. However, it was not recalled quick enough, and the organization Change.org has created a petition that has recently acquired 280,000 signatures, pleading for retailers like Target, Walmart, Amazon, and Dollar General to remove this doll from toy shelves. The petition's author wrote, quote, "This is not okay for a child's toy. This toy needs to be removed from our stores. What will this toy make our innocent, impressionable children think? That it's fun when somebody touches their private area?" That's where her quote ends. And good lord, only in the 21st century could it be considered a crime for you to enjoy somebody touching your private parts. Anyway, she goes on to say, quote, "that pedophilia and child molestation are okay? It's not okay. It's not fun. It's damaging and has long-term effects on a child's mental/physical health." It is kind of discerning that this child's toy has this feature, of course. However, I don't think it promotes pedophilia and child molestation, as the leader of this petition infers. But apparently 280,000 people disagree with me, as that's the amount of signatures she received on her petition. Of course, as a result of the outrage, the Poppy doll was removed from retailer shelves. They said, quote, "This feature was designated to react to the doll when it was seated, but we recognize the placement of the sensor may be perceived as inappropriate. This was not intentional, and we are happy to provide customers with a replacement Poppy doll of similar value through customer care team. We are in the process of removing the item from purchase." Now, I will give the petitioners this. They literally cut out a perfect oval right between the legs of the Poppy doll. You can go online and watch the video of a mother being very upset with the fact that her daughter received this present for her birthday. And for the record, I do agree with the person who made this video that the sounds made by the doll when you touch her private parts are slightly, let's face facts, it's entirely sexual and quite gross. But the title of this lady's post is, quote, "Is Hasbro normalizing grooming and facilitating of child abuse?" I just fail to see the dots connected between this doll's private parts making odd sounds to children being sold into sexual slavery. I know it's quite a serious topic for me to bring up, but I think it's important that we focus on the real enemies in this majorly important situation rather than Hasbro, who just for once in the past, 60 years of making toys, finally put a button in the wrong place. I just think it's a poor allocation of potential resources in order to go after a doll rather than the people actually promulgating the most evil activities taking place in modern society, grooming and facilitating child abuse. Anyway, that is where we are going to end that little story because it gets a bit more serious as we go on and talk about it. I think it's kind of funny that a doll is becoming a political issue. Everything these days becomes a political issue. Nevertheless, I'm going to move on because I don't like talking about political issues. Which brings us to our Florida story of the week, in which a pilot of a plane made an emergency landing on a Florida highway. This occurred last Friday, and the 29-year-old pilot said that he had, quote, "mechanical issues with his Piper PA 28-140, which affected the flow of fuel, and he was not able to return to his home base safely. As a result of this, he ended up landing on a Florida highway. He landed at 10:30 p.m., and thankfully the plane did not strike any cars. Unfortunately, however, it did block 2 lanes of traffic until the plane could be moved to the median shoulder. I'm completely out of my mind this week. Leave a comment below about what makes you feel insane, and I'll mention it in my next podcast. I'm sure that's a great advertisement, isn't it? I'll share with thousands of people how you feel insane. Anyways, it should be noted that the plane flyer was not injured whatsoever, and neither was anybody on the streets of the highway. I'm now going to read you the number 1 comment of the story. Quote, "Only in Florida. You never hear about this happening anywhere else." It's hard for me to disagree with that. That is why it is my Florida story of the week after all. And now we are going to move on to my second favorite story of the week. A nurse which set off a fire alarm in order to see one of his colleagues' breasts bounce as she ran down the corridor. So clearly people have gotten absurdly desperate when it comes to interaction with females. As somebody who's been locked up since March, I can relate to that. However, I don't think it's an appropriate thing to pull a fire alarm in a hospital in order to see your fellow nurse's breasts bounce as she runs down the hallway. Anyway, this gross story begins as a senior nurse, who was the manager of the dementia ward in a hospital at Nottingham, decided to pull a fire alarm while there was no emergency in the hospital itself, in order to simulate breasts bouncing with his hands as he made sure to take advantage of a panicked colleague who dashed down the hallway. Now, this story takes a dark turn as 3 women working with this young nurse said that he would, quote, drop pens or keys on the floor and ask them to pick them up. In one of the most disgusting stories involving this young nurse, he once asked one of his subordinate nurses, who returned to work after a wrist injury, quote, I'm upset because you can't give me a hand job. So clearly this young man has priorities beyond his means that also impact his fellow nurses in quite a disgusting way. After meeting with the nurse who broke her wrist, he said, quote, you can still do the lollipop, and he made a gesture with his hand and mouth. After she said no, he went on to say that she was both sexy and pretty, and, quote, may I touch your bum? So clearly a disgusting creature this young nurse may be. I don't think he'll be working long in the healthcare industry. However, when the nurse was asked where the allegations came from, he said, quote, I do not know, and I don't think I will ever know. He has denied every allegation against him. However, 3 allegations against him have come out over the past year alone. I will now give the man's argument. He says, quote, from the time the allegations were said about me, it has never been the same. Not only for myself, I am a father of 4 kids. I so love my wife. I married her in 2015. From the beginning, I am telling the truth, and only the truth, and that is what I will stay obedient to now. So he is committing to the fact that he did not harass these young nurses. However, the evidence is well stacked against him. It should be noted that that is just my take. Perhaps the jury will come up with a different one and the man will be considered innocent. However, I suggest that you look up the story and make sense of it for yourself. For now, we are going to move on to a Save the Tapeworm story. These are activists who are for saving tapeworms, which for those who don't know are those slimy little things that live in the flesh of other animals. And as disgusting as they are, scientists are now making a case for why they should be saved. They say, quote, parasites play a crucial role in the ecosystems around the world, making up around 40% of animal species. So for those who don't know what a tapeworm is, basically it's a worm in the shape of tape, like gift wrapping tape. And they basically live in your body, surviving off of your own nutrition system. In spite of how creepy that is, a team of scientists have recently released a, quote, global parasite conservation plan. In defense of their argument, they say, quote, parasites have a major public relations problem. Most people really don't like the things that they do, but in fact, they're really important in ecosystems. They go on to say, quote, we know nothing about them. We don't even know their names, and we definitely don't know what they are doing within ecosystems. So they're defending the parasites by dint of them being in the ecosystems, but they cannot say why they're in the ecosystems. They go on to state the example that, quote, when they're in a cricket, they manipulate the cricket's behavior, making the cricket jump into water, basically committing cricket suicide. So they're basically defending these worms that turn animals into zombies. But hey, I don't want to be a science denier, so I should believe these fellas. Anyways, it's said that parasites can keep the tip of the food chain balanced by organizing food webs and help keeping some animals from becoming too abundant. One of the scientists plays the victim card for these parasites, saying, quote, "We think that about 1 in every 10 parasite species might be threatened of extinction in the next 50 years from losing their habitat. But when we account for that they might also lose their hosts, it's pushing the idea closer to about 1 in every 3 species of parasites." So this young lady is worried that we will not have enough parasites within the next decade or two. I tend to disagree with that position. Screw the ecosystem. I don't want a frickin' tapeworm inside me. Unless it would help me lose weight, in which case I am welcoming to any and all parasites, which would help me with my Julian Michaels weight loss goals. Anyways, the scientist goes on to say, quote, "That's an extinction rate that's almost unthinkable at broad scales." She's very pro-parasite, which is kind of frightening. These are the kind of humans that scare me. However, in her defense, she says, quote, "If we see the total collapse of parasitic ecosystems, we have no idea what that is going to do." Of course, she is correct. In that we have no idea what that would lead to. It might lead to us being entirely prosperous in a way that has never been seen in mankind, and it might also see our destruction in the most violent way possible. Either way, that's the end of this segment. Please stay tuned to our next segment, where I will be going over a prison escapee who was caught after nearly 50 years on the run, as well as other crime stories. So please stay tuned for that, and after that, we will get to my top 10 wizards in history. Whether you believe in them or not, we will get to them. Stay tuned.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. We are about to dive into my most innovative stories of the week, including a Colorado prison escapee who was caught after nearly 50 years of evading policemen. After this segment, we're going to get into my top 10 wizards, but for now, let's jump in to my innovative stories of the week, beginning with background performers in film being replaced by mannequins. This story begins with a background performer. In the most personal sense, the young actress was spending up to 14 hours awaiting to film her scene. The young woman said, quote, "We're very tight together. We're used to it. It's how we usually exist in that world. But it's not possible anymore." The reason this young lady feels that she's been experiencing a lack of opportunities is because not only that showrunners have been reducing scenes to their bare minimum, including no background performers, but also that smaller production videos and films are now using mannequins in place of background performers. One actress was quoted as saying, "It's like, oh great, we're being replaced with dummies." The same woman complained that even before this epidemic of mannequins being used as background characters, she was already struggling for work, as unions have monopolized their position in the film industry, saying, quote, "So if you're not a union backer or performer, your chances of working are now slim to none." All those spots have been filled by a union performer. There's not that many to go around, and I'm not sure how many of us can continue to do as a sole method of income, which it was once for me. So it's kind of a sad story, this story of innovation, as I've titled it. Unfortunately, this young lady is losing her job due to this innovation. We can only hope that the Austrian economics are correct and this young lady will be reallocated to a more efficient portion of the economy. Sounds nice and dark and cold, doesn't it? Another background extra was quoted as saying that after the COVID-19 pandemic, quote, "my expectation is that we will get back to a reasonably normal amount of work." But the work is set and going to be quite different. Another young lady background actor was interviewed, and she had a quite, how shall we say, irate response to the whole situation, saying, quote, "what I see is the producers maybe going back to the way it used to be when it came to casting background, where you would have folks brought back again and again and again, and put them into different wardrobe, put them into a different wig, or put them into different glasses." So, clearly the world of background actors is under attack, and it's our duty as good American citizens to fight against that. The woman previously quoted went on to say, quote, "at the beginning of the scene, the producers would have the performer put on 8 shirts, and they would have them walk by, and then they would get off camera, take off a shirt, walk back, put on a hat, and take off a shirt. They would walk differently and have different gaits. And instead of hiring 40 backgrounds, they only need 7. So, I don't typically like to side against the people being interviewed, but I'm all for progression, whether or not it means we have a lack of people being hired in the background actors section of the economy. The young lady went on to say a quite apocalyptic finisher for her quote, saying that everybody else is nervous and looking for alternative streams of revenue. So, unfortunately, it looks like this is the end for our great background actors. Say goodbye to all your favorites. They will not be seen again. Alright, our next innovation story, beer being used as green energy. However, beer alone cannot be used as an energy source. It has to be first combined with sewage sludge. This unfortunately disgusting combo creates a biogas, which is naturally produced from the decomposition of organic waste, which in turn powers the entire power plant. This combination of beer and sewage to create energy is being exclusively used at the moment in South Australia, where it provides services to around 1.5 million people. It is said that they get their heavy beer supply from pubs, bars, restaurants, and clubs, which have all been shut down as a result of the pandemic, and the reallocation of booze is putting a distant resource to good use. It is said that the wastewater plant is repurposing about 150,000 liters of expired beer every week. As a result, the plant has been seeing renewable energy generation boosted to around 654 megawatt hours in a single month. As a result, the power plant has been generating a record number of cubic meters of biogens and biogas every month since the pandemic began. The energy company has been quoted as saying that the champagne producers have lost an estimated $2 billion in sales this year alone as a result of the pandemic. The energy company alone is saying that they have themselves created a repurpose of such energy and are making sure that it's not a $2 billion waste, but rather a much smaller number. They went on to say that it is a shame that the beer industry is struggling like this, but, quote, at least the stale beer has been put to a good use. They go on to say that they plan on keeping this reallocation of energy as something that, quote, can be adapted for the long term. So who knows, maybe the order of operations goes nuclear energy, fracking energy, beer energy, and that's where we'll be next. Alright, time for our next story. We're going to follow up on something we covered last week, a high school which suspended a teen who tweeted a photo of her overpopulated hallway as COVID-19 cases were bounding through the school. It was said that the young lady was readmitted to her school last Monday. However, it has since come out that the school itself has contracted 9 cases of COVID-19. Of the 9, there are 6 students and 3 staff members who have contracted the disease. All of these cases have taken the school by surprise, as they all occurred after the young lady posted her photos on Instagram last week. In response to the incident, Harvard Medical School explained, quote, the time from exposure to symptoms onset, known as the incubation period, is thought to be 3 to 14 days, through symptoms typically appear within 4 or 5 days after exposure. A person with COVID-19 may be contagious 48 to 72 hours before starting to experience symptoms. Of course, you all probably knew that, but these 9 people who went to school did not know that they were spreading the disease. And so there are likely much more than just 9 cases at this school, which has grown fame exclusively through controversy. Alright, that's just a quick update for the weird news. We're going to move on to a news story in which Apple takes legal action against a small company who uses a pear as their logo. According to the founders with the pear as their logo, quote, Apple has opposed the trademark application for our small business, demanding that we charge our obviously pear-shaped logo to Apple as a stolen property used to represent our brand in the recipe management and meal planning business. So this isn't even a tech giant that's using a similar sign to the Apple logo. It's actually a meal planner and grocery list app. The app's name is Prepare, get it? And they go on to say, quote, before attacking us, Apple has opposed dozens of other trademark applications filed by small businesses with fruit-related logos. Many of these logos were changed or abandoned. Most small businesses cannot afford the tens of thousands of dollars it would cost to fight Apple. I think it's pretty absurd that Apple is trying to defend their logo basically by saying, oh, this is a fruit, and any other logo that looks like a fruit is an infringement on our copyright. I think Apple might be overstepping their bounds in that regard. Prepare says that they are a small company with only 5 staff, and that legal costs have already cost them many thousands of dollars, plus laying off 1 team member in their legal fight against the iPhone maker. Quote, it is a very terrifying experience to be legally attacked by one of the largest companies in the world, even when we have clearly done nothing wrong, and we understand why most companies just give in and exchange their logos. We feel a moral obligation to stand against Apple's aggressive legal action against small businesses and fight for the right to keep our logo. We are defending ourselves against Apple not only to keep our logo, but to send a message to big tech companies that bullying small businesses has consequences. Prepare seems to have the public side when it comes to this issue, as they have received 8,200 signatures out of a goal of 10,000, so they are only a few hundred away. If you would like to go ahead and give your signature to this small business, feel free to do so. But for now, it's time for me to move on to our last weird news story of the week. which takes place in my good old goddamn hometown, Colorado, in which a prison escapee was caught after evading police for 50 years. He escaped in 1974 and was found living under an alias in small-town New Mexico. This was eventually discovered by one of the Denver police officers who was shot by the young convict decades ago. The man was arrested last weekend in New Mexico City, where he had been living under the pseudonym Raymond Montoya for over 40 years. The convict had previously shot a Denver police officer after the officer tried to check for weapons in the young man's vehicle. He was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon, but eventually escaped from prison. The police officer who was shot recently retired, but eventually he, quote, got a phone call from an individual, and this person said, "I've thought about it, and I'm going to tell you where the guy who shot you is." 46 years later, and out of the clear blue I get a phone call, while this person gives me his address and his alias, and other facts that mean nothing at the time. The man was quickly arrested. He was caught living 20 miles north of Santa Fe in New Mexico. An FBI special agent in Denver said, quote, "Arrest should send a clear signal to violent offenders everywhere. The FBI will find you no matter how long it takes or how far you run, and we will bring you to justice." Except it wasn't the FBI who caught the guy or brought him to justice. It was the Denver police station. Speaking of, the previous Denver police officer went on to have quite passive words towards his offender, saying, quote, "I would love to sit down and talk to him. He may or may not talk to me, who knows?" So clearly he has a passive approach to this man who possibly could have killed him, which is a pretty brave approach to the situation. Perhaps this will open up more opportunities for police to connect with their community, even those who have committed heinous crimes. But that is it for this goddamn segment. Why don't you stay tuned to the next one? I'll give you my top 10 wizards throughout all of history. It'll be entirely ridiculous, and I know that's why you listen to this podcast, so why don't you stay tuned, by God?
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Weird News Podcast. I have for you now my top 10 wizards throughout all of history. We're going to dive right in with Abe no Seimei, who was considered to be the Japanese Merlin. Don't worry, we'll get to Merlin later. In Japan, he served as the court wizard to 6 different emperors. He created a bunch of spells that would protect the Japanese emperors from evil spirits and illness. I don't know about you, but the fact that this young wizard lived during the term of 6 different emperors was quite a well-formed sign that he was not very good at his job. I mean, that means he let at least 5 die during his term. However, the Japanese stay by their claim that he was said to have a second sight, which helped him identify demons and fight in magical combat. The wizard became so popular in the East that the equidistant 5-pointed star became his symbol, which in the West is known as a pentagram. According to legend, he was not fully human and was in fact half a fox spirit. It is said that he is the father of Japanese wizardry, and nobody has yet to overcome his legacy throughout all of the Eastern world. Alright, number 9, Nicholas Flamel. This man is most famous as being the inventor of the Philosopher's Stone, which has appearances in Harry Potter books, as well as the Full Metal Alchemist stories. Despite this, he was actually a real person from the 17th century. He was a well-known alchemist and a sorcerer who is said to have created the first Philosopher's Stone, which had the ability to turn anything into gold, or the elixir of life, which of course offers immortality. When he wasn't wizarding, he would work in a bookstore. It is said that while working in the bookstore, a man came in and sold the man a mysterious book which he had dreamt about the night before. Written in an unknown tongue, Flemel managed to decipher the book and discovered its magical secrets. After discovering said secrets, the wizard became incredibly wealthy very quickly. In fact, he became so wealthy that he had a house in Paris that was so well built that it is now the oldest standing stone house in all of Paris. Before his death, the wizard had inscripted on the house, quote, "We plowmen and women living in the porch of this house, built in 1407, are requesting to stay every day in the name of our Father and Ave Maria, praying God that His grace forgive poor and dead sinners." His book on alchemy was not questioned until about 150 years later. The wizard's alchemic works were abandoned until about 2 centuries later, in which Victor Hugo mentioned them in his book, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Similarly, the great pianist Eric Satie was very interested in this ancient alchemist's works, and as a result they were popularized enough in pop culture to become a substance for the best-selling novel Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. But that's enough of him, isn't it? Let's go to Morgan Le Fay, who was the half-sister of King Arthur, who was actually against King Arthur and used her powers to get him off the throne as a grand attempt to thwart his works. She was known to be a powerful enchantress, and it is implied by her name alone that she is a powerful fairy creature. She is the apprentice of Merlin, the aforementioned and later to be mentioned wizard, and she is most well known for using the knowledge she gained from him against him. In popular lore, she is not always portrayed to be a wicked wizard, but to always have been struggling for what she thought was right from her own perspective. Alright, moving on to number 7, Michael Scott. This isn't the man from The Office. This is in fact one of the most influential European intellectuals of the 13th century, who also insisted on having an interest in the occult. He was a native in Scotland, but instead decided to study in the Spanish city of Toledo. It is said that during his studies he learned their magical secrets and began translating many of their texts into Latin. He eventually gained fame as the Moor's personal astrologer in the Holy Roman Empire, as well as being the tutor of the Pope. It is said among his greatest accomplishments as a wizard, he changed the course of the River Tweed, which was said by the Holy Roman Empire to have never been completed before this time. Although Moses had split it, Michael Scott was the first to reverse it. However, he did not strike the favor of many religious writers, as the world-famous Dante chose to feature him in his Inferno book, in which he is punished eternally in the level of hell reserved for wizards. And in real life itself, he came to an unhappy ending as he was burned on Melrose Abbey. Alright, number 6, the Great Rasputin. I personally would like to put this at number 1, but since I've previously mentioned him on this podcast, I will not subject you to such an atrocity. Rasputin was, of course, the most famous among wizards during the final days of Tsarist Russia. He was known to be one of the most charismatic people in all of Russia, possessing healing powers, which he used to save the king and queen's daughter and son on multiple occasions, earning him mass popularity throughout the entire nation. However, as a result of gaining the king and queen's popular opinion, he also gained the disdain of all of the other quote-unquote wizards of the time. Basically just noblemen who were jealous that their money couldn't stand up to his wizard-like healing powers. As a result, he was assassinated in one of the most gruesome and one of the most epic ways anybody has ever died. I've stated this on the podcast before, but I'll go ahead and sum it up for you quickly. He was poisoned several dozen times, stabbed a couple times, shot a couple times, and finally drowned before he died. Of course, most of that is likely urban legend. However, due to his reputation as a great healer of Russia, it is not outside of the realms of reality to assume that all of that happened. Alright, number 5. John Domingo. John Domingo was a voodoo wizard of Charleston, South Carolina. He claimed to be the necromancer that would raise the dead and use them to enforce his own brand of law. He gained so much fortitude as a wizard during his time that sailors would actually approach him in order to buy wind from him to ensure a safe journey when crossing the great seas. He also quickly gained authority over the legal authorities of the time. Citizens of the local city would seek him out in order to solve their legal problems. It is said that he died in a similarly epic way to Rasputin. He was fighting two people who created a violent robbery. It is said that he dragged the two men into the street, comparing himself to Jesus, and then an invisible hand drew upon him, lifted him off the ground, and choked him to death. The same invisible hand then threw him to the floor, and his body aged rapidly and quickly withered into nothingness. It is said that his ghost still wanders throughout all the streets of Charleston, waiting to find people who are committing crimes, so that he can punish them the way he did upon his final moments. Next, wizard. Marie Lavieux. I believe this is number 5. She is another voodoo sorceress. However, she gained her popularity in the crazy town of New Orleans in the 19th century. She began a business, being one of the first American female entrepreneurs, creating a beauty parlor which also specialized in voodoo services. She is known to have mixed Roman Catholic saints with African spirits in her rituals. She was also famous for her divinatory skills, as she claimed that her divinations were enabled by her extensive network of informants. She is most well known for stealing the secrets of rich patrons in order to place fear in the hearts of their servants. She would do this in the name of voodoo, and thus formed her newly formed store into a place of potent magic. Even though she has long since been dead, many people visit her house in order to make wishes. This is a really interesting story to me because beyond her just faking being a wizardress, she's clearly a very clever con woman, taking the rich of the time and making sure she blackmails them as they visited her beauty parlor. I think that makes her quite a clever lass. Alright, number 4. Aleister Crowley. He has since been labeled the most wicked man of the first half of the 20th century, as he was a devoted occultist and a practitioner of ceremonial magic. He helped form the occult group, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, before abandoning that organization and later founding his own, which was titled Thelema, which was based on the versions of his oracle-like visions, which he said were entrusted to him during his travels to Egypt. He was most well known as being evil because of his many rituals which involved sex and drugs. And similarly, as a result, he stays extremely influential in modern occult circles. Alright, number 3. John Dee. Oh wait, this is number 2, isn't it? Alright, number 2, John Dee. He was an English mathematician, which is how I believe all wizards start out. And he was a mathematician before he became a well-known astronomer and occultist in the 16th century. It is said that he was one of the most convincing of the historical wizards because his magic always played with science itself, always being grounded in reality. He served as the court astrologer of Queen Elizabeth I and devoted much of his life trying to communicate with spirits, often using mediums. In true movie fashion, he was eventually convicted of murdering children and using sorcery accompanied with hellhounds in order to help him conjure the damned souls. It is also said that he attempted to commune with angels in an attempt to learn the universal language of creation in order to achieve a pre-apocalyptic unity of mankind. He did all of this within a mathematical and astrologistic research system, which based all of his magic in reality, making him one of the most universally received magicians of his time. Alright, time for number 1. Of course, this is going to be Merlin, the legendary sorcerer of the Arthurian legends. It is unknown whether or not he was historically prominent during his time, or whether he was in fact confabulated by Geoffrey of Monmouth. That's who's credited with creating him, if he was created. Anyways, he was described as being both the son of the devil and a servant of God. Merlin is mostly well known for embodying 3 archetypes, that of the madman, the poet, and the seer. Of course, he is most famous for being an embodiment of the struggle between good and evil, as he would advise the great King Arthur, bringing him all of his fame as well as his greatest misfortunes, which eventually led to the ruin of the Arthur Kingdom. Isn't that too bad? Well, you know what's even worse? This is the end of the goddamn GSMC Weird News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Nevertheless, I'll ask that you subscribe to the channel so that you can get future updates as quickly as possible. Similarly, if you could subscribe on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, that would be fantastic. We're also on YouTube if you choose to listen to us on there. If you do, that's fantastic, but nevertheless, it's time to end this episode. Thank you for listening, and I will see you later this week. Thank you. Have a good night.